وينشر الهدي إيمانا وموعظة فبالجهالة قد خابت مساعينا غابت مناقبنا واسود حاضرنا غابت مناقبنا واسود حاضرنا وأوشك اليأس أن يغشى أمانينا.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Welcome to another edition of the Sulaimaan Ravat show. Another week has lapsed. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be interacting with the viewers of ITV. And I say this every week, but I say it every week because I mean it. It's a pleasure to interact with you, all of you out there, fellow South African citizens and fellow brethren, in whichever way we can connect and we can talk and we can discuss. It's always something which is enjoyable. Another week has lapsed in our lives, a week that will never return. So we make dua to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala accepts our humble efforts in the last week and forgives and overlooks the deficiencies. And our dua every week is may the upcoming week be better than the next, and every week better than the previous one. And like that, we progress in life. There's very short life, but a very important opportunity which Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala has given us. Now, we've had a lot of talk about elections and we've had a lot of debate between political parties. When I look back at the last 2 months, it's been very hectic. It's been very quick-paced. We've had the ANC, we've had DA, COPE, UDM, the whole lot, some of them debating amongst one another. And then in between, we had Idris Khamisa. We spoke a little bit about Muslim minorities existing within a non-Muslim state and civic responsibility, participation in politics and that kind of thing. But that's been the trend with this particular program. Every now and again, we get personalities in studio who have great experience, great knowledge, and who can share with us their pearls of wisdom and who can enlighten us with their many years of experience and with their different perspectives, so that we all grow in our understanding and we all grow in terms of how we view the world, not only South Africa and what's happening in South Africa, but the global context, both from the perspective of Muslims and human beings in general. I'm very, very privileged this evening that we have in studio former Western Cape Premier and stalwart in ANC circles, and now the South African ambassador to the United States of America, and that is none other than Ebrahim Rasool. Ebrahim, the pleasure is all mine. Welcome to the studios of ITV. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah, Moulana, and to your viewers. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for the work that you do. And may this be a barakah to the ummah, inshallah.
Inshallah. When I started out in media some 10 years ago, you were still the Premier of the Western Cape, and we followed very closely your progress as Premier, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on in the show. But I just wanted to mention that because it's the first time I'm getting to meet you in the flesh. I think some 5-6 years ago, there was a program that Awqaf had hosted, and you spoke at that program, and mashallah, your speeches always was very captivating. But let me, if you allow, start on a, I wouldn't say a lighter note, but perhaps a softer note. You're now living out of the country, but you're a South African by heart and by birth. What do you miss most about our country, and what do you most look forward to every time you return?
You know, Moulana, when you sit in Washington, D.C., you are sitting probably in the capital of the world where major decisions are made. But the things that you miss about a small town like Cape Town and a small country like South Africa is the people. It's the sense of community. Because while people overseas may be rich, while they may be materially blessed, what they have lost in the time of accumulating their material goods has been bonds with each other. Families are dispersed. Neighbors don't even interact with each other. Muslims don't have the culture of visiting each other even on Eid. They don't have the idea of exchanging foodstuffs during the month of Ramadan even. And so everything is so personal, so private, so closed, that what you miss the most about South Africa is a sense of community. And so may Allah always make sure that the Ummah of Muhammad in South Africa, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is blessed with enough material goods to survive, but always retain the ability to have a community in which we know each other, love each other, and engage each other, inshallah.
Amen. I don't know how often you return to South Africa, but is there anything that stands out for you in terms of differences, in terms of something about South Africa that was not there prior to your departure?
I must say that other than the way in which the political debate has been a bit more confused, because when I left here, I think we had a clearer sense about where we stand politically, that we were with the forces of liberation. I think there's a bit more confusion. But I also think that things that are changing is really that South Africa has attracted many different Muslim groups from across the world. They come from all over the world where they have been repressed, where they have been limited, where their rights have not been fully realized, where they suffer from Islamophobia. They move to South Africa, set up headquarters here in South Africa, and enjoy the freedoms. And sometimes some of them are mischievous. They even use the freedom that they enjoy in South Africa that they've had nowhere else to undermine the freedom that we have here in South Africa by calling this bid'ah, calling that haram, calling that makruh, and putting their labels. And they don't understand sometimes that, that South African Muslims are like this, and the South African Constitution gives us those rights because we have exercised it responsibly over 300 years, alhamdulillah.
You are now currently the ambassador to the United States of America, and I'm sure being an ambassador is a very interesting thing in itself. Then being an ambassador to the United States, and on top of that, being a Muslim. But we'll talk about that in a moment. For now, the question that comes to my mind, that I'm sure you're enjoying what you're doing, and it's very interesting, and you've made much progress, but do you miss mainstream South African politics?
I must say, given all the things that went down in the ANC in the Western Cape, in the politics of the Western Cape, sometimes you feel that you should have stayed on as premier to complete your work. But when you come to the United States of America and new opportunities open, you know, that's the moment that you realize that all you've got to do in this world is to put yourself in the hand of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That sometimes when you're fighting for a position out in Cape Town, Allah has a bigger plan for you. And so I'm not saying that I am happy to be away from mainstream politics, but I have seen probably a bigger purpose that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has opened for me. I have been able, at a very crucial moment, remember I came to the United States when the pastor was burning the Quran in Florida, when the Christians were marching against a masjid in New York near the site of 911, and where Islamophobia was at its height. And everyone was perplexed and said, why does South Africa send a conscious Muslim to us at this moment? But alhamdulillah, the curiosity about it has opened up so many inquiries to me and so many hearts that I've been able to reach out to the 8 million Muslims who are in the United States and who are battling with all these forces, and for me to share our experiences from South Africa. How did we reach a situation where South Africa could send a Muslim to be the ambassador in Washington? And on the other hand, I have been invited to address the synods of the AME Church in the United States, to preach in the Episcopalian Church, and so forth. And so people see Muslims and Islam with other eyes once you start speaking. And even in terms of reaching out to the government of the United States, we have been able not only to do the work that South Africa wants of us, like fight for PEPFAR funds, fight for the African Growth and Opportunities Act for our trade relations, but also at the same time take the gentleness of South Africa and present it on a global stage. So I have no regrets, alhamdulillah, although I miss some things.
There are many perceptions, especially amongst Muslims, with regards to the US, and many would say primarily because of the US's foreign policy. But you've been there now on the ground. What are your observations regarding Muslims living in the US?
I think that Muslims living in the US are basically taking full advantage of living on the technological edge of the world. They do amazing things with the Quran in the United States of America. They've got an app for it. They've got really great things that they are doing, technologically taking Islam forward. I think that Muslims in the United States, especially those who come as refugees from war-torn areas like Syria, from occupied territories like Iraq and Afghanistan, they find a voice and they find a freedom that they've not had in their own countries. And so Muslims are learning to live with freedom. But I think at the same time, they don't understand this Islamophobia, because this is supposed to be the land of the free, and yet Islam is profiled. If you look like a Muslim, you are open to what they call stop and frisk. You can be searched anytime. You are profiled at the airports, etc., etc. So I think that it's a duality, an ambiguity that the Muslims in America are living in. And alhamdulillah, what I am able to do is to bring an example of a South African Muslim community that is probably living in a Darul Salam, a Darul Aman, a place of peace and security. And this is the example that they look for in us.
You are tuning to the Sulaimaan Ravat Show. We go for a quick break, and after that we return. Welcome back. This evening in studio we have the South African ambassador to the United States of America, the former Western Cape Premier, Ebrahim Rasool. The discussion thus far has been very fascinating for me, and I hope that all our viewers out there are enjoying it as much as I am. Ebrahim, you spoke about Islamophobia, but I suppose there are two parts to it broadly. One is Islamophobia that is as a result of what the authorities do, like you mentioned, stop and frisk. But what's it like on ground level? One gets the impression, down here in the southern tip of Africa, that Americans, by and large, perhaps not all of them, are actually scared of Muslims, and that there's a deep misunderstanding and there are many misconceptions with regards to Muslims. Are Americans genuinely scared of Muslims? Are they genuinely scared of Islam? Apart from what happens at the airport and infiltration at masjids and the kind of things that you would see from the authorities. I'm talking of the layman and women in the street.
You see, things like Islamophobia arise, on the one hand, because of what is done to us as Muslims, and on the other hand, what we do ourselves in the name of Islam. So when you fly aeroplanes into a building in the name of Islam, when you do suicide bombings in the name of Islam, and when you do acts of terror in the name of Islam, then you are creating a vicious cycle. Because you may have a legitimate reason for being angry with the world, and particularly with the United States, because of occupation and all of those kind of things, and war that is conducted by the US. But you must always be in command of your response. You may not determine what is done to you, but you must determine how you respond to it. And in Surah Al-Fath, the chapter on victory, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that we could have, at Hudaybiyah, chosen to fight. And Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu and the Sahaba were willing to fight. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intervened through the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam to restrain the hands, because we needed to be in control of our response. And I think that when we are not in control of our response, and we in a sense outsource our anger to those who are not steeped in the religion deep enough, or who misuse our religion, then we allow an image of our deen to go out that defines all of us as violent, irrational, angry people. And then fath, whatever spectacular victories we score. Remember, the word fath is not only to secure a victory, the word fath is also to open up, as in Fatiha, the opening. And when what you do looks spectacular, but it closes hearts to Islam, you have done the opposite of a victory for Islam. When it closes the hearts of the non-Muslims to the Muslims, you have in fact had a defeat. And therefore I think we must be able, always in this world, to walk with a double-edged sword. One edge deals with those who are our enemies and are violent and are conflictual towards us, but the other edge must always be one that deals with our own problems, our own hotheads, and our own extremists in our ranks.
Do you think American Muslims are responding accordingly? Are they winning the battle in terms of how they've positioned themselves and how they interact with the rest of America as the Muslim community in countering this Islamophobia and this image?
I think that there is an emergence in America of a confident group of young Muslims and old Muslims who are saying, this is who we are. We are not like the extremists, and we are not here at war with America. We are Americans and we are Muslims. But I think that there may be one other tendency that reacts to America with anger, and that's where the breeding place of extremism comes. But then I also think that there are unfortunately also Muslims who bend over too backwards to be accommodated. And they would want to appear less like Muslims. And so when your name is Ebrahim, everyone calls you Abe because you're fitting in. You dress like them in order. And so what I'm saying is that what we can teach from South Africa is how to integrate. And the key to the word integrate is integrity. How do we retain our integrity of our identity and at the same time respect the integrity of our nation to be South African or American? We cannot assimilate. And the key to the word assimilate is to become the same. We are different, but we are not against what we are different from. And so there are some who assimilate, and we've got to teach them how to integrate. Inshallah, we will integrate and retain our integrity, but we cannot isolate and be extreme. So those are the three methodologies. And South Africa, alhamdulillah, shows the way for integration rather than either isolation or assimilation.
Coming back to the political dimension of your responsibility as the ambassador to the United States, how would you describe the relationship between the US and South Africa, obviously on that political diplomatic level? And the reason I ask, one could get the impression sometimes that it's a relationship with a bit of tension. The US and South Africa don't always see eye to eye, especially on foreign issues, foreign policy. Then with regards many issues on the African continent, South Africa many a times would be taking a position very different to that of the United States. And then there might be those who would believe and say that the US is seen to be a bit more in the corner of Nigeria as opposed to South Africa in this battle of the two giants on the continent. How would you describe the relationship?
I would describe the relationship as good, but not smooth. Because South Africa is neither a client of the United States nor an enemy of the United States. Why is the relationship good? Every year now, alhamdulillah, we have a trade exchange between South Africa and the United States of $16 billion US. Every year, the United States assists South Africa with the fight against HIV and AIDS to the tune of almost $500 million US. And there are many other exchanges like that makes the relationship exceptionally good and strong. It is not smooth because South Africa doesn't always agree with the United States. Sometimes we agree with them, as in Libya, and sometimes we disagree with them on other matters, like their approach on Egypt, for example. So we don't toe the line like many other countries would want to do when they are faced with a superpower. But the United States knows that South Africa will always be independent and tell the truth. And that means that we have the right to differ with them on how they're approaching the negotiations between Palestine and Israel. We would believe that you cannot be a referee if you have already sworn undying allegiance to one side in the equation. And so I think that that's it. So the United States may say, okay, who are other countries in Africa that we can also put our eggs in their baskets? So they look at Nigeria, they look at Kenya, they look at this, they look at that, in order not to rely entirely only on South Africa. They may want other leaders to emerge in Africa, because if South Africa leads the African Union, then Africa as a continent will have this kind of relationship with the United States, where it is neither a client nor an enemy, but will be independent. So that's what superpowers do. They hedge their bets. They need proxies and all of those kind of things. But the United States cannot deny that South Africa on the continent is the leading democracy. It may not any longer be the biggest economy, but it's the most diversified economy. It's the most industrially based economy and the most knowledge-driven economy. We don't just sell oil. And that South Africa has the rule of law and human rights more than many other countries, even in the world, and therefore they can't ignore us. And I think that South Africa needs to retain that independence if it is to be taken seriously on a global stage.
We've had many negative happening in South Africa in the past 5 years, some of which has dominated global headlines. The Marikana massacre. Then there's this, some would call it an obsession with the current president of the Republic and leader of the ANC, this constant vilification and demonization of Jacob Zuma. Does this feature in the United States? Does it get much coverage? Does it come up in diplomatic circles?
I think it features at a mass level because the Marikana, you must remember, thousands upon thousands of Americans had participated in our struggle for freedom. They marched against South Africa during apartheid. They boycotted our goods during apartheid. They didn't come to our universities and they didn't come perform here. So thousands of Americans are intimately connected with South Africa, so they watch everything. So when a Marikana happens, and it is the biggest number of deaths at the hands of police since the struggle, then they have a reason to be worried. But I think they also worry about leadership in South Africa after Nelson Mandela. And so these things feature. And these are the things that we need to explain.
I suppose Oscar Pistorius has overshadowed all of that.
And Oscar Pistorius overshadows that because now they're watching our justice system, whether it is a fair justice system.
Okay, you are watching the Sulaimaan Ravat Show. A guest in studio this evening, South African Ambassador to the United States and former Western Cape Premier Ebrahim Rasool. Another ad break and we continue thereafter, inshallah. Stay tuned. Welcome back. In studio, we have the South African Ambassador to the United States, Ebrahim Rasool, and we've covered quite a few aspects pertaining to what's happening in America and how South Africa is viewed there and how South Africans view what's happening there. One interesting happening in the last few years during your tenure as the ambassador to the US has been the visit of Barack Obama to South Africa. And there were two things that happened there. One was prior to his visit, Patricia de Lille's decision as the mayor of Cape Town to grant him the freedom of the city. And that generated a lot of controversy. Palestinian activists were extremely upset, and many human rights activists in the Muslim community was up in arms, saying a man who has been the mastermind of these drone attacks and who's behind all this foreign policy, even though it may not be in the category of what George Bush did, although there are those who will say it's in a category worse than that. But nonetheless, there was a great degree of discomfort and there was a great degree of expression of anger as to why he was granted the freedom of the city. And one of the responses that the DA has been giving, and the DA's representative in the studio on this program a few weeks back said, well, if that's bad, then South Africa accepting the man and allowing the man to visit the country, if he's this criminal and if he's this man with blood on his hands, then the ANC-led government allowing him into the country, that's also problematic. And although the ANC would respond and say, well, there is a difference. That's politics and diplomacy, and it's a state visit, granting him the freedom of the city. That's revering a person to a different level altogether. How do you view all of this? Because obviously you come from a very stock background of activism and you identify with issues like the Palestinian cause. On the other hand, you know South Africa, you know the US, you know politics, you know diplomacy.
But look, I think that if even Americans, even Democrats, Obama's own party, if even African Americans are uncomfortable about aspects of Obama's policy, both domestic and foreign, then who are we who are across the ocean to be immune to having those misgivings ourselves? Of course we must worry about drones. Of course we must worry about surveillance. Because we don't want a world in which someone reserves the right to decimate you or to spy on you. And so we must remain vigilant about all of those things. But at the same time, we need to understand that an isolation policy, if we were to say to President Obama, we don't like your drones and we don't like your surveillance, so please, let's cut all our ties. Are the activists who say that conscious of the fact that they will put out of work all the farm workers who through the African Growth and Opportunities Act export goods to the United States? the car manufacturers. Because every car, every C-Class Mercedes-Benz and every 3 Series BMW that drives in the US is made in South Africa. And so I can go on. The HIV treatments. I think we've got to find the appropriate balance to have enough independence to express ourselves and to oppose the US on aspects of its policy, particularly foreign, but at the same time to service a market in the United States that creates jobs back home and creates opportunities for our people. So I think that where the problem comes in, and sometimes our activism forces us not to see the trade-offs that we need to do and the balance that we need to find, because for many activists, life is black and white. But when you have to both look after South Africa's foreign policy and its economic interests, then you can't think like an activist. But it doesn't mean you suspend your critical faculties. And for as long as we reserve the right to oppose wrong policies, to vote against it, and not to participate in it, I think South Africa is doing justice to its constitution.
If you were still the Premier of the Western Cape and you had an ANC member as the Mayor of Cape Town, and there was this talk about giving Barack Obama the freedom of the city, would you object to it?
Look, I think that we'd argue about it. We'd debate it, and we'd ask why we'd want to do it. Is it a public relations exercise, or is there really something that we like about President Obama? I mean, even the Nobel Committee is wondering, did they jump the gun to give the president the Nobel Peace Prize before he had even shown his hand in government? And so I think it's a debate that we would have conducted in that way. I would say that we have other priorities. When you have people without toilets, when you have people without houses, as it is today. I know we had a program when I was Premier that brought it up to 90%. When I look at the propaganda of the DA today, I don't think that they've increased the 90% access to water, electricity, and sanitation. We've had a program to look after the 27 poorest areas where people still have buckets in which they must do their private business. I would say, let's sort that out. Don't be morally outraged when people throw poo at the airport, but you're not providing them with the toilets, and you've suspended the 27 poor areas program that was put in place just because you don't want to do what your predecessors had decided you must do. When you have taken the growth rate that the ANC left in the Western Cape of 5.8% and you brought it down to under 2%, rather focus on getting the economy back on even track rather than trying to spin it that you are the best government. So I would say that those are the things that we should be debating.
You mentioned this about DA spin, DA propaganda. They would obviously argue that, and they claim this actually is in their manifesto, that the Western Cape is the or that the divide between the haves and the have-nots is the narrowest in the Western Cape in terms of unequal society. They're on the best footing. And they seem to have the support of the media in this regard because, like it or not, justified or not, there is this perception, widespread perception in South Africa that the Western Cape is the best run province, and that has become a model of efficiency and so to speak, a model which the DA now is projecting to the rest of the country and say, look, vote us into power on a national level, make us the ruling party, and the rest of South Africa will be run as well as the Western Cape is run.
You know, I think for elections, one must give big mouth, must give forgiveness for exaggeration. Yeah. Because that's the stuff. When election campaign, you've got to subtract 20 to 30% for just exaggeration and maybe some dishonesty.
From all parties.
From all parties. That is the stuff of election. But I want to really say, today, the fastest growing economy is not the Western Cape, it's Gauteng. When I left that office, the Western Cape was the fastest growing economy with a growth rate of 5.8%. We were number 1 and number 2 over my term for matric pass rates. The Western Cape has slid back. Other provinces have moved beyond it. I left there with over 90% access, as I said, to sanitation, water, and electricity. They've not improved that. When I was there, the unemployment rate in the Western Cape was 23%. Helen Zille today says it is 22 something percent. That's not a massive improvement. You are boasting with the achievements of those who went before you. And so I would say we must give big mouth for exaggeration to any party at this moment. But I think it's a myth that the Western Cape is the best run province at this moment. No other province are people desperate enough to throw poo on the streets and at the airports.
Let's talk about South Africa in a broader sense. There's obviously this shifting and changing political dynamics and uncertain realities as well. Inequality is growing. There's tensions within the alliance. That's undeniable. Service delivery protests on the increase. They're becoming violent. You're an insider who's outside. How do you view all of this, and how are you analyzing all of this?
Look, I think South Africa's strength is also its weakness. Our strength economically is that we are on Africa the most integrated global economy, meaning we do business with Europe, with America, with South America, with China, Russia, Australia. We are globally integrated. But that's also our weakness, because when the US and Europe goes into recession, the knock-on effect is very strong, even though the epicenter of the recession is not South Africa. So when the US and Europe went into recession and didn't buy our goods anymore, we lost 1 million jobs in South Africa. So our strength is our weakness. The question that I think we need to ask after 20 years of freedom, what do we need to do now? And the president is right when he says we need a second transition. The first aspect of the second transition that we must do is to move from the socio-political gains we've made in the first 20 years, the human rights we have, the rule of law we have, the democracy we have, the 16 million people who get grants and pensions and so forth that we have, the access to schools and education and the water and electricity. We've got to move now and make a transition from those gains to the economic gains. We've got to say, how do we get land to our people? How do we get more jobs? And how do we get ownership over the economy? The second aspect of that transition is we've got to move from quantity to quality. We've got a lot of schools, a lot of clinics, and so forth. Now, we must now say, what is the quality of the education we give? What's the quality of the healthcare we give? What's the quality of the services we give? And if we can get those things right over the next 20 years, then inshallah, South Africa will have weathered the storm.
Okay, we're going to go for one more break, and when we return thereafter, inshallah, the final segment of this program with Ebrahim Rasool. Stay tuned. Okay, welcome back. We now move on to the last segment of this evening's show. And just to remind those who may have tuned in late, we are talking this evening to Ebrahim Rasool, the current South African ambassador to the United States of America. And he's also the former premier of the Western Cape. We spoke a little bit about South African politics just before the break, and we spoke about the ANC. You are an ANC man. It must be difficult, I suppose, in one way, and also interesting in another way, to have witnessed from outside what has happened to the ANC in the last 5 years. It hasn't been the easiest of 5 years. After the recession, they've struggled. They would claim that they managed to do well despite the recession. Opposition parties will say, well, you made these promises and you haven't delivered. But apart from that, service delivery protests, the number increasing, the nature of it violent. You've had the Marikana massacre. You've had all the controversy around e-tolls. You've had the whole Nkandla saga, the Gupta saga. It hasn't been the most smooth of 5 years for the ANC.
No, I think it's been a difficult 5 years. And I don't think that the ANC has been as united as it used to be to manage the 5 years in a particular way. I also think that when people are losing their jobs and the recession is biting and there's less money to go around, then the population is a bit more sensitive to what they deem as excesses by those on top. And so even if Nkandla is ordinarily not a big thing, but in the context of your life where you're struggling to buy a bread, it gets magnified. Mm. And even if people know what is a reasonable wage demand to make for a mine worker, but when there is this perception that people are living high on the hog at the top levels, then people make excessive demands at the lower levels, which is out of reason. When people would ordinarily have patience with service delivery, but when they think that people are chowing something at the top, then they get a lot more reactive. And so I think that those are the kind of things that are happening. It's really, there's an objective reality where I believe the ANC is managing things well, but I think that there's a subjective reality that is being projected in a particular way, but I don't think that the ANC has often managed it in the best possible way.
One has been the challenges in as far as the ANC running the country, as the government of the day, the ruling party. But the other has been these internal challenges. We know what happened in Polokwane. Many would say you were a victim, if you could put it that way, of the change in leadership at Polokwane. But moving away from Polokwane, the alliance is in trouble. COSATU is on the verge of imploding. Some would say, others would say they would survive, but they would be much weaker. And then whilst Mangaung has solidified the Zuma faction, if we want to use that phrase or that description for a moment. On the other hand, the other likes of stalwarts and former cabinet ministers like Ronnie Castles breaking ranks and saying, this is not the ANC we know. This is not the ANC that Madiba led and the ANC that Madiba gave his life for. And we are prepared to go to this extent and say that rather spoil your ballot than vote for the ANC. Now that, I suppose, is a very different development as compared to, the populace of the country and the citizens reacting to the ANC as a ruling party.
To use the term that you used as victims of Polokwane, I think that there are probably quite a lot of people walking around with wounds after Polokwane and Mangaung from within the ANC. And you've said that I would be one of them. But the fact of the matter is, the fact that I still come here, despite carrying some of those wounds, and saying to people, you've got to vote for the ANC, is not simply an endorsement of the leadership. It is an endorsement of an entire 100-year history of struggle. It's an endorsement of 20 years of achievement, and it's an endorsement of a faith that only the ANC has the capacity to deliver to our people what they will do, even when they are beset with problems. I think that for me is the bottom line. And when I localize it to being a Muslim, I would not be saying to Muslims, take the Ronnie Castles route. Because when you have brothers and sisters in Palestine fighting for the vote, when you have brothers and sisters in Egypt fighting to get back the product of their vote, when you have the Syrians fighting a civil war for the vote, we cannot be cavalier because we fought for this vote for over 300 years. And so now you can't simply make it as if it's a toy and instrumentalize it in a way like that. We've got to be able to say that in the modern day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's instruction for us to be a community who conduct our affairs by mutual consultation, by shura, that it means that the shorthand for shura in a complex, huge democracy is through the exercise of the vote. So I think we must exercise it. The second question that comes then is around how do you make your choice within such a vote? And I think that Ibn Taymiyyah, from a Muslim perspective, teaches us that Allah favors the non-Muslim ruler who is just rather than the Muslim ruler who is unjust. Meaning that whoever says that you cannot vote for a non-Muslim hasn't read Ibn Taymiyyah, hasn't read the classical scholars of Islam, if Allah would favor a non-Muslim ruler who is just. So you can vote for non-Muslims. I think some of the strategic questions that come in are around, should you favor a party of liberation or a party that has its origins in apartheid? And many on the right side of our political spectrum will say, no, apartheid is gone, don't look at us. But many in a party like that, on the right side of the spectrum, are still essentially fighting to hold on to the gains that they made, the ill-gotten gains, during the apartheid era. They want to slow down land reform, not equalize land distribution. They want to slow down economic inclusion, not accelerate economic inclusion. And what they are doing now, and they unfortunately have these examples like Nkandla and the personality issues, they have a siren song that is so sweet to invite other minorities into the lager, not to protect the gains of the other minorities, but to protect the gain of the minority that comes from apartheid. And so I would say that our orientation is still largely towards liberation. And then I think the final test for us is it in the maslahah? Is it in the interest of the Muslim community that they should be aligned to governance or aligned to opposition. Now, I think from where I sit in Washington, I see the Muslim community of the East largely under dictatorship. The Muslim communities of the West, minorities, largely suffering from Islamophobia. All of them look to South Africa and see what the ANC has done to create rights for us, freedom of religion for us, equal opportunity for us, participation in the economy for us, education for our children for us. And therefore, they want to see how we are coping with the challenge of governance. I think what Nkandla tells us, what issues of corruption tells us, is that if we remain, and we must remain, allied to governance, we must add a stronger vigilance, that nothing must be done that goes against the values of our deen. If you look at India, the absence in the last few decades of participation by Muslims after we had played a sterling role in the liberation of India. But our absence from the political terrain now faces us with the prospect of a government led by a person who had led and sanctioned and allowed a massacre of Muslims. And if we had remained allied to governance, we would have to retain that influence and power and leverage over the governing party so that our brothers and sisters would be able to look at us as an example and we could clear the future for our emerging generations.
You've mentioned this, and this obviously is very pertinent to the Muslim community that is a minority in South Africa. However, the reality is shown. In Cape Town, we've already seen the Muslim vote go the way of the DA. In the last municipal election, we've seen the Muslim vote here in Gauteng go the way of opposition parties. What advice would you give to South African Muslims in regards to that, and also in regards to then occupying that political space? Because as you say, that you have to be relevant and you have to be there to be able to make a difference.
I think it sometimes, as I say to the Muslim community, it sometimes makes you feel good that you have voiced your opposition. But in the long run, do we want to face a scenario like India, where our rights are eroded, where we are no longer an example of coexistence, where our people are subjected to massacres, and where the RSS moves in to remove our students from universities, from jobs, and all of those kind of things? I think that what we need as a Muslim community is not to give up, despite the problems like in Nkandla and others. We can't give up and close the door on governance. We have to make sure that the ruling party sees us as a constituency that is allied to governance, but exercising vigilance. We must never be quiet when wrong things happen, but our voice is amplified when we are inside the governance tent, rather than just joining the apartheid relics, throwing stones from the outside. The moment we tie our wagon to the apartheid relics, protecting their narrow interests, we have discredited ourselves and disqualified ourselves from influencing the course of South African society, and we no longer act as the beacon of light in a world of dictatorship for Muslims and in a world of Islamophobia for Muslims. Inshallah, may Allah guide us through this process and make the right choices. I have my preferences and I've expressed them. If people don't want to listen to what I'm saying, let them at least think about the implications of the things I'm outlining, because a lifetime in the ANC, for me, with wounds to show for it, I think says to me, despite the personal injuries, we've got to make the choices in the maslahah of the ummah, in the interest of the ummah today. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen.
Ebrahim Rasool, it was fascinating talking to you. Jazakumullah, and I hope to talk to you again in the future, inshallah.
Inshallah, it's fascinating talking to you, and may Allah reward you for the work that you do.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Well, until we meet again, viewers, fi amanillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
فالمسجد الأقصى ما زال يدعونا ندي على الفتية الأحرار في زمن أضحى به الحق بالخذلان.